Larry, would you like to come and present our program for us?
Okay. Well, I began my historical research when I was working on my master's degree at Pittsburgh State. That would have been in the 1970s. And in one class, I read and reported on 15 books that I had that summer. And I wanted it to be on local history. And so that is really what started my searching for information. And the way I did it probably was backwards. I would pull books from the library shelves and I would look in the index for Baxter Springs. So if I found a book that had something about Baxter Springs in it, that would pique my interest, and I would then turn to the pages and find out what was inside that book. And that is what then led me to start my research on the Nez Perce Indian tribe. The Nez Perce Indians were a tribe of Indians in Idaho and Oregon. And in 1877, they were, by government edict, they were told to merge and go to a reservation, a much smaller reservation than the lands that they had in Oregon and Idaho. A few of their warriors were upset about this, and they fired shots at some of the local residents in the area, which started the war, which lasted then all summer and into the fall, all going in almost to the winter. And so I've titled this book, or this article, "The Nez Perce in Baxter Springs, Kansas." The 21st day of July, 1878 was a very typical summer day in Kansas, very hot and terribly humid. And in the west, a billowing storm front was building, promising a forthcoming thunderstorm very soon. Several hundred local citizens had gathered that evening on the platform of the railroad station, awaiting the arrival of a special train from Fort Leavenworth. Between 6 and 7 p.m. that evening, the train arrived carrying the famous Chief Joseph and his people, the Nez Perce, or as they called themselves, the Nimipu. These people had since the previous November been prisoners of war at Fort Leavenworth, following their capture that autumn at the Bear Paw battlefield in Montana. They had eluded the U.S. cavalry for a number of months, making their way all through the state of Idaho, through Yellowstone National Park, ultimately making their way to 60 miles from freedom, and they called it the land of the old lady, which of course would have been Canada. That's where Sitting Bull was. He was the participant in the Battle of the Little Big Horn, and then he and his warriors then fled their way into Canada for safety. It was the fate of the Nez Perce Indians that they had been released from military authorities at 4 a.m. that morning. They boarded the train with all their possessions and suffered an excruciating trip of 14 hours to Baxter Springs that day. Earlier in the day, they had been released from military authority and status as prisoners of war. They were released into the hands of civilian overseers, in this case the Quaker agent at the Quapaw Agency south of Baxter Springs. Now, there's a difference between the Quapaw Agency and the Quapaw Reservation. The Quapaw Agency was the north half of Ottawa County, and it consisted of all of the reservations of those Indians. Today we know them as the 9 tribes or the 10 tribes, the Modocs, the Wyandots, Ottawas, and so on, and the Quapaws. Each one of those tribes had their own individual reservation. The Quapaw Agency was the governmental agency that encompassed all of those tribal reservations. This was the end of the journey, and it was a jumping off place for all the tribes who would be relocated to the Quapaw Agency in Indian Territory. And this was part of the President Ulysses S. Grant's peace policy of 1868, in which he wanted to take all of the Indians who were captured, to take them out of the military's control and turn them over to the Department of the Interior. And they would have, believe it or not, religious organizations would be the ones, different denominations would be the ones who would be in control of the Indian tribes. In Ottawa County, they were completely, they were identified with the Quaker religion. That was the only religion that was allowed to have control in the Quapaw Agency. There were other agencies in the state of Oklahoma or Indian Territory that were given exclusively to certain denominations, and I'll get with that a little bit later. Upon their arrival at the Baxter station, nearly 410 frightened and very tired and sick Nez Perce disembarked from the train, witnessed by the curious stares of the many local onlookers. It was too late in the evening to continue into the territory. Thus, the exhausted Nez Perce were forced to spend that evening camping in the railroad freight yards. The train had originated in Fort Leavenworth 14 hours earlier, making their way down from Fort Leavenworth down to Fort Scott. Believe it or not, they came through Columbus. The train did not stop here in Columbus. It did stop in Fort Scott, and that's where they filled the boilers up with water and so on. And then made their way through Columbus. They did not stop until they got to Baxter Springs. The journey that day had been a horrific experience. The stifling heat had resulted in over half the people being prostrated by heat exhaustion, to the point that they required assistance to depart from the train. Sadly, 3 children succumbed to the conditions on the train. The freight yards then became their camp for the night and the burial site for the unfortunate children. And the story that I've written is that I found that unfortunately this would be a situation that would be a part of their entire existence. Every time one of their people would die, they buried them very quickly, and almost as soon as they were buried, well, then the dogs and the pigs and the coyotes would unearth their bodies, and so there's no any idea of where they're located, or in no way to recognize their place of burial. These were the first of a succession of deaths and rapid burials that would begin at once. The sad occasions plagued this tribe for the next few months of their stay in the neighboring Quapaw Agency. Within a matter of months, nearly 1/4 of those who had arrived at Baxter Station would succumb to any number of illnesses that even medicine could not cure. And most of the literature says from that time that the Indians died of malaria. However, in my research and discussing with the biology departments at Missouri Southern, they said there really has never been a case of malaria here in Cherokee County. It would be the Anopheles mosquito is the source of malaria being transferred, and it's just non-existent in this area. The story of the Nez Perce flight and the period spent in exile is one of the most compelling sagas in American frontier history. It's a story of a people treated shabbily by the U.S. government, forcing them to endure a long period of suffering, hardship, homesickness, and death. It's also a story of a people who, through a series of broken government promises, suffered broken hearts and shattered dreams. People forced to endure the hardships and needless neglect of a corrupt and intolerably arrogant local Quaker agent. His name was Hiram Jones, whose mission was ostensibly to civilize and Christianize his newly accepted savages from the Northwest. He called his methodology the straightening out process. As the chief of the Nez Perce band, Joseph was a spokesman and advocate in restoring his people to their homes so far away. From the moment of their arrival in Baxter Springs, Joseph labored tirelessly, despite so many odds, to educate the outside world of what tragedy was befalling his people stranded in the Indian Territory. Joseph was a frequent visitor to Baxter Springs during this time of exile. As chief, he often spoke to newspaper reporters and the public in general about the treatment of his people, their suffering, and of course, the dying. He perfected his speeches to ever-present audiences, and with gifted talents of oratory, captivated his audience, whomever it might be. He used the telegraph at the station nearby to fire off innumerable communiques to various Washington dignitaries, begging for compassion and asking for freedom for his unfortunate band. It was from this station in Baxter Springs that Joseph and his trusty ally Yellow Bull and interpreter A.I. Chapman departed in January 1879 for a monumental trip to Washington, D.C. There he lobbied the case for his people and their freedom. He spoke to dignitaries, Washington socialites, congressmen, and even the great chief, President Hayes himself. His campaign stirred the imagination of newspapers in the East and inquisitive groups such as religious organizations and many congressmen who embraced their plight. But freedom was far from coming anytime soon. And I mentioned to you that the Quakers were the only religious denomination that was allowed to have the agency occupancy in Ottawa County. To the further west, there were other agencies and different denominations then also were given complete control within their reservations or within their agencies. And the Nez Perce found out that the Presbyterian Church was the one that they would go to when they were moved from Baxter Springs. The Nez Perce would remain in this area for a period of 10 months before they again unceremoniously were moved to another permanent home, as they were always called. This time the move would take them to near present-day Ponca City, Oklahoma. In April 1879, Joseph had moved his people to a new location unilaterally on the west bank of Spring River, just south of Baxter Springs, below the city. Realizing that their days at this camp were to be short, the Nez Perce made many treks into this border town. The trip could easily be made on foot, either by following the river trail into town on the east or following the military road to the south. The women used this opportunity to bring their highly coveted moccasins and gloves to town to trade for merchandise needed at the new home in the west. It was said by the merchants that the Nez Perce women were some of the shrewdest traders they had ever met, and they couldn't take advantage of them. Bows and arrows were also eagerly sought by the townspeople. Now, you've got to bear in mind that they spent 10 months in this area. They were not prisoners of war, and for that reason, they were allowed to, they were given rations every week. Beef and so on would be killed and divided up among them. The women then could take the hides, they could tan them, and then they would make moccasins and so on. The boys would like to make bow and arrows, and one of the reports from, I think, the New York Times stated that one of the games that the kids would play would be to shoot their bow and arrow and hit a nickel, and the object was to keep the nickel for themselves, which they would. The warriors who so bravely crossed the rampaging waters of the Northwest on their ponies and so proudly had displayed their equestrian prowess were forced to walk into town. And the main river that they would have had to have crossed would have been the mighty Snake River. If any of you have been out west, you know that is a very, very deep, fast-moving river, and they were very, very skilled equestrians to be able to cross back and forth over that river. They then were taught by local citizens how to pair up and drive teams of draft horses and mules pulling wagons. This skill was needed, for they then would become drayers and teamsters to drive the animals on the trip to the west. And it took a total of 40 wagons to take all of their possessions and all of the people from Baxter Springs over to the Ponca City area that month. Joseph and his interpreter Chapman were seen almost daily on the streets of as the massive preparations were being made. Joseph even frequented the local Planters Hotel, and if you're familiar with the Baxter Museum, the pictures on display of the Springs Hotel, that was the same hotel, but the earliest name was actually the Planters, not the Springs. He would sign his name in the guest book. Joseph remarked that he and his people had been treated well by the townspeople of Baxter Springs, but, quote, he now had to follow the decisions of the Great Spirit, unquote. And the Nimipu would be going on west to a new home. The first week of May 1879, the caravan of wagons and human cargo left this region, never to return, leaving nearly 1/4 of their number behind in such a short time. Almost 1/4 of their number of people actually died and are buried in this area. The interment of your ancestors in this area is the most significant aspect of our local history. Many questions remain and are yet to be answered, but the designation of this extension of the Nez Perce Trail to include Fort Leavenworth, Baxter Springs, Quapaw, and the Ponca experience should help to make all aware of the tragic episode that occurred nearby. And the object of our work that I have been involved in is to ultimately expand the Nez Perce Trail from Idaho and Montana across to as far as St. Paul, Minnesota, down to Fort Leavenworth, down to Baxter, to Quapaw Agency, and then ultimately over to Ponca City, and then to make the trip back up to Idaho. If this designation is done, then this will be part of the national trails. Like we have so many national trails already in existence, but it does take the work of Congress for that to be done. Let me see. There is a memorial in Baxter Springs. If you have not been there, it is located on the grounds of the library there in Baxter. And this memorial will always serve as a reminder at this time to the descendants of this generation of Nez Perce and to the future generations of Baxter Springs residents who will become familiar with the Nez Perce and what happened to them while they were here. And this will hopefully be a permanent bond between Baxter Springs and the Nez Perce people. Today, sadly, the bones of Nez Perce lie buried and scattered across half a nation from Idaho in the west to as far as east as Kansas and Oklahoma, never to be located or repatriated to their beloved Northwest. With these monuments, however, it is a certainty that their time here will not be forgotten. We too will remember. And the object, as I mentioned, was to make this trail a permanent trail designated by Congress, but there also is an attempt to make the monuments at each one of these places. We have one in Baxter. There was one in Quapaw on Spring River until the flood came a few years ago and wiped it out. But there is also one in Fort Leavenworth as well. And their attempts are to put these monuments in various locations throughout wherever the trail was. And so that is the object of the Nez Perce Trail Foundation, which I've been a part of. Does anybody have any questions or anything about?
Well, you're talking about monuments.
Yes.
And all these locations. You're talking about where they were originally in Idaho and Oregon.
Right.
Is there a location there, a specific location where they?
Well, the reservation is at Lapwai, Idaho.
What is it called?
Lapwai, Lapwai. A town that is significant is Lewiston.
Sure.
Lewiston, Idaho.
Right on the Snake River.
Right on the Snake River, yeah. That is where they started, and the war lasted for 4 months, something like that. And I said They started in Idaho. They went down to it's called the Lolo Trail, across to Montana, then down to almost to Wyoming, across to Yellowstone National Park, and then on up until they were 60 miles away from Canada. Ultimately, they were captured at Bear Paw Battlefield, national monument in Montana. Like I said, it was 60 miles away from their freedom. Many of their people did, in fact, flee and were able to make their way into southern Canada. And the rest of them under Chief Joseph. He was not actually a war chief. He was actually the chief of the people. His job was to make sure that the women, children, and the elderly always stayed ahead of the warriors. The warriors were just a handful of fighters who fought the U.S. cavalry over several months period of time. They had the advantage of being sharpshooters. They knew the terrain, and they could hold the U.S. cavalry off at bay, and they did for many months until ultimately they were captured by two different units of U.S. cavalry, but they were exhausted after so many months of trudging. They had started out with thousands of horses. They were down to just a few, and the people were really in bad shapes physically. And so, as I said, they were at Bear Paw Mountains, and they elected to rest for a day or two, and that was their undoing because they were so close to Canada and would have made their way to freedom had they continued on. But Joseph was very famous because he's made the statement when he surrendered to the U.S. cavalry. He said, "At where the sun now sets, I will fight no more forever." And he never did. He continued to fight for justice for his people throughout the rest of his life, and he died in 1904. He was moved to the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington, and I've spoken there, and also been to his grave there. And he was never given the opportunity to return to his homeland. He was the chief of the people, but he was an absentee chief because when they were in Ponca City, Oklahoma, they had a number of Presbyterian ministers who worked in their congregation or in their tribe. Nearly half of their people were Christianized, and they joined the Presbyterian Church, and half of them did not. They wanted to continue the old traditional way of belief in a god they called Shmohala. And so when they were at Ponca City getting ready to go back to their home, they asked them, all of you who want to be Christians will go to Lapway, and those of you who want to continue worshiping the Dreamer, you will go to Washington State, to the Colville Reservation. And so you had that schism, the split between the two groups within the same tribe. And that exists to this day. You have one body of Nez Perce in Colville, where you've probably heard of the, can't think of the name of the dam in Washington.
Is it Grand Coulee Dam?
Grand Coulee, yes, thank you. That's where the Colville Reservation is located. And then the other one is at Lapway or Lewiston, Idaho. And so half of them went to one, half of them to the other. Out of the 410 individuals who landed at the Baxter Springs Station, there were only a little over 200 of them who went back to Idaho and Washington 6 years later. So many of them were left in unmarked graves here in Oklahoma and Kansas and so on. Anyone else?
Do you know anything about how many of the descendants or from the tribe still are there?
Well, there's
Population of any?
still a lot of descendants who have, in fact, some of them who have the same names. But an interesting fact, whenever they were here, they got their rations every Saturday, and they had to sign. The chief had to sign for the rations to be distributed to each head of the family. And so when you read the roster and everything, a lot of them are the Indian names, and then as the weeks and months went by, those names changed because as they became Christians, they were given English names. And so you will have a roster, a very long list of families that were getting rations, and some of them would have the Nez Perce name, and some of them would have the Christian name. And so today you have the same situation. You have some who still carry an Indian name, and some who carry the traditional Christian names.
So they were at Bear Paw. They were captured.
Yes.
And they were brought to Leavenworth.
They were captured at Bear Paw, and then they were traveled overland to the Yellowstone River. They were put on boats, and then they went downriver on the Yellowstone to the Missouri River, and they made their way to Bismarck, North Dakota. Bismarck, they were then put on trains and were taken to St. Paul, and then from St. Paul down to Fort Leavenworth by train. Now, the thing about, I want to back up a little bit here. One of the tribes that is in Ottawa County is the Modoc tribe. I'm sure you've probably heard that name. The Modocs are a very, very small tribe. They also had fought a war in the West, in California, and Southern Oregon. That's where they were from. They actually were, they were ultimately captured at the lava beds in California in 1873. And they did not treat them the same way that they did in Nez Perce. The leader of the Modocs was captured, and he and several of his underlings were all hanged publicly in front of the tribe and their family members and everything. They then were put in trains, and they were shackled, and they were brought to Baxter Springs as prisoners of war in freight cars. That's different from the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce did come from Leavenworth down to Baxter Springs, but they were regular passengers. However, it was a 14-hour ride, and they did, as I mentioned, got very ill on the trains and everything when they got here.
And there were 400 of them at Leavenworth that came down on the trains.
Yes, yeah. There were, I believe, 410 were in Baxter Springs when they arrived that day, and half of them were sick. They had to be helped off of the train and so on. And again, it's probably because of the heat and everything like that on the train. Anybody else? Well, I guess that's all I have for you.
Great.
Thank you.